Liren had lived for 3 centuries, and she had never known true fear before this day. She was an elven ranger who had bonded with Veilstrix many years ago, and together they were feared across all the lands because Veilstrix was a crimson dragon, whose wings could cover the sun when she flew at full size, and Lyraean herself was skilled with bow and blade. Like few others in the Emerald Kingdoms, they had fought against shadow beasts in the frozen north, and they had destroyed mechanical armies that the fallen Dwarven Empire sent against them, and they had even defeated corrupted druids who tried to twist nature into horrible shapes. But nothing in all those battles had prepared Lyraean for what she would see on this terrible day. It started when the sky tore open. Lyraean was flying patrol over the eastern borders when she saw it happen, and it was not like the gentle shimmer of portal magic that her people used to travel between distant places, but instead, it was a violent ripping of reality itself, like someone had taken a knife to the fabric of the world and cut it open with brutal force. A massive object came through the tear and began falling toward the ground, and it was unlike anything Lyraean had ever seen before because it was huge and angular and covered in strange markings that glowed with an unnatural blue light, and no magic came from it at all. Yet it moved with clear purpose and terrible power. Veilstrix made a low growling sound that rumbled through Lyraean, where she sat on the dragon, and the dragon spoke into her mind saying that this thing smelled wrong, and that whatever it was did not belong in their world. The massive object landed in the disputed borderlands between the Emerald Kingdoms and the Obsidian Wastes, and those wastes were home to the Krelzar, who were a savage warrior race that had caused problems for the civilized lands for thousands of years because they were 8 feet tall and covered in natural armor that looked like the shells of insects, and they only understood conquest and eating their enemies. Within just a few hours, the Krelzar had gathered a huge army, and Lyraean watched from high above as 50,000 of the monsters marched toward where the strange object had landed, and they moved with the confidence of predators who had never been defeated in these lands. Lyraean asked Veilstrix if they should warn whoever was inside that metal thing, and the dragon responded with dark humor, asking if they should warn the monsters or the invaders, and saying that maybe they should let them destroy each other. But Lyraean was too curious to just fly away. So she urged Veilstrix to move closer while staying hidden in the clouds, and they watched as the Krelzar army surrounded the strange vessel from all sides. Lyraean expected to see fear or panic from whoever was inside the metal thing. But instead, she saw something very different, because the sides of the vessel opened up, and humans came out. There were not hundreds or thousands of them, but only 200 soldiers, and they wore armor that looked soft compared to the hard plates that covered the Krelzar, and their armor had strange patterns of green and brown colors on it, and they carried weapons that looked too small and too simple, with no glowing enchantments or crackling magical power. One human stood at the front of the group, and she was a woman with hair the color of wheat, and eyes that looked like ice, and she held a small device up to her mouth and spoke words that Lyraean could not hear from so far away. The other humans spread out in patterns that seemed random to Lyraean because she had been trained in military tactics for many decades, and their formations made no sense to her trained eye, and they took positions behind barriers and in the shadow of their vessel. The Krelzar chieftain was a massive creature named Gorzak, and he was famous for crushing the skulls of his enemies, and he stepped forward from his army and bellowed his challenge in the trade tongue that most races in this land understood. The chieftain shouted that the humans were standing on Krelzar hunting grounds and that they must submit or be eaten. The blonde woman lowered her device, and when she spoke, her voice somehow carried across the entire battlefield with amplified clarity, and she said that she was Commander Kate Morgan of the United Earth Colonial Marines, and that the Krelzar had 30 seconds to leave or face consequences. Gorzak threw back his head and laughed, and it was a sound like boulders grinding against each other, and his entire army of 50,000 warriors joined him in mocking laughter that echoed across the plains. Kate Morgan did not laugh back at them, and she did not even seem angry, and she simply raised one hand and said 2 words. She said to light them up. That was when Lyraean learned what real thunder sounded like, because the sound that came from the human lines was like the world being torn apart. And it was not a single sound, but thousands and thousands of smaller sounds all overlapping into one sustained roar that turned the air itself into a solid wall of pressure. Lyraean had heard dragons roar, and she had felt the earth shake from siege magic, and she had witnessed lightning called down from the sky by storm mages. But none of it compared to this sound. The Krelzar charge had barely started when the front ranks simply ceased to exist, and there was no other way to describe it, because one moment they were warriors charging forward with weapons raised, and the next moment they were just pink mist and scattered fragments. The invisible force did not stop with the first rank, or the second, or even the 10th rank, because it carved through the Krelzar army like a farmer's scythe cutting through wheat, except the wheat was made of flesh and bone, and the dreams of warriors who had never imagined their own deaths Veilstrix turned away from the scene without Lyraean even needing to command it, and even from this great distance they could feel the air itself vibrating with violence. The dragon spoke into Lyraean and asked what kind of magic this was, and her voice carried something that Lyraean had never heard from her bonded companion before, and it might have been fear. Lyraean whispered back that she could see no magic at all with her elven sight, and there were no spells being cast, and no gathering of magical energy, and no incantations being spoken, and there were just those small metal tubes the humans carried and the endless thunder. The massacre lasted less than 3 minutes from start to finish, and 50,000 Krelzar warriors had marched on the human position with absolute confidence, but only about 500 of them survived long enough to run away. The Krelzar did not run from battles because running was not something their culture understood, but now they ran, and their eyes were wide with terror that Lyraean had never seen from their kind before. The humans let them go and did not chase them. As the dust began to settle over the killing field, Commander Morgan spoke again, and her voice still carried across the distance, and she told her soldiers to cease fire, and she ordered medical teams to move forward, and she told someone to find out if any of the Krelzar could talk. Lyran watched in confusion as some humans moved forward, while others did something to their weapons, and they were not reloading with arrows or charging them with magic crystals, but performing quick practiced movements that suggested they could make the thunder continue forever if they wanted. Veilstrix spoke into Lyran and said that they needed to report this to the council immediately. Lyraean replied that no one would believe them. The dragon said then they needed to make the council believe. 3 days later, Lyraean stood before the High Council of the Emerald Kingdoms in their ancient chamber, and she told them everything she had witnessed. High Counselor Theron sat on his ancient throne and listened to Lyraean with growing doubt in his eyes, and he was a silver-haired elf who had lived through the last great war and seen many things, but what she described seemed impossible to him. Lyraean told the council that 200 humans had destroyed 50,000 Krelzar warriors in just minutes, and she explained that they did it without any magic at all. Counselor Maris stood up, and she was a specialist in war magic who had studied combat spells for over 2 centuries, and she said that what Lyraean described was completely impossible, because no mundane weapon could create such destruction. Maris suggested that perhaps the humans used some unfamiliar form of magic, or maybe explosive alchemy that Lyraean had simply failed to recognize. Lyraean insisted that there was no magical signature at all, and she said that she would have sensed it with her elven sight, and Veilstrix would have felt it through their bond, and whatever these humans used operated on principles that none of them understood. Theron concluded with the certainty of someone very old that it must be magic, and perhaps the humans simply hid their casting better than most races could, and he said that, regardless of how they did it, the humans had eliminated a Krelzar army, which helped the kingdoms. The High Counselor proposed sending an emissary to thank the humans and encourage them to leave their realm peacefully. Lyraean asked what would happen if the humans refused to leave. Theron smiled in the way that predators smile and said they would remind the humans that they were guests who had stayed too long, and he said that after all the kingdoms had dragons and magic that had kept these lands safe. For 10,000 years Lyraean wanted to argue, but protocol demanded silence once the council had made their decision, and she was dismissed with a wave of Theron and sent back to her duties with orders to watch the humans, but not to engage with them directly. She returned to the borderlands and to her watching post in the hills, and she saw that the humans had not been idle during the 3 days she was gone. More vessels had come down from the sky, and they were building things that Lyraean had no words for, because buildings appeared in days instead of years, and walls rose overnight and strange devices hummed with purposes she could not understand. There were so many more humans now, and they moved with purpose, like ants in a colony, where every individual knew their role without needing constant instruction. One woman seemed to be in charge of the construction, and she had dark skin and sharp, calculating eyes, and Lyran watched her direct hundreds of humans with remarkable efficiency, and the woman wore a vest covered in tools and carried papers with precise drawings on them. A voice spoke behind Lyran and said that the woman was Lieutenant Amy Brooks. Lyran spun around with her hand going to her bow and found a human, standing just 10 paces away, and he was young with brown hair and a crooked smile, and his hands were raised in a gesture of peace. He wore the same strange armor as the soldiers, but he carried no weapons in his hands. Lyran demanded to know how long he had been standing there. The human admitted that he had been there for about 20 minutes and said that she was very focused when she watched, and he introduced himself as Private Danny Walsh and explained that he had been assigned to make first contact with the locals. Danny gestured at Lyran and said that she was a local, and noted that she had been watching them for 3 days straight. Lyran realized she was supposed to observe and not engage, but the human had found her. And running would show weakness, so she identified herself as Lyraean of the Emerald Kingdoms and said she watched to ensure they meant no harm. Danny said that was smart, and he lowered his hands slowly and told her they meant no harm and explained they were just trying to establish a colony because their world was complicated, and some of them wanted a fresh start. Lyraean pointed out that they had slaughtered 50,000 beings to establish their colony. Danny replied that those beings had attacked first, and according to what their computers had translated, the Krelzar wanted to eat them, and he said that humans were not big fans of being eaten. Lyraean conceded that the Krelzar were monsters, but she said the humans killed them with such terrible efficiency. Danny said that humans were very good at killing, and his smile disappeared for a moment, and he explained they had a lot of practice at it, but they were trying to be better, and that was why he was here talking, instead of shooting. He asked if maybe they could not be enemies. Lyran studied him carefully, and he seemed sincere, but she had lived long enough to know that sincerity and safety were different things, and she told him that the decision was not hers to make, and that her council would send an emissary. Danny brightened and said that was great, and that Commander Morgan loved meetings, but then he paused and gave Lyran a fair warning. He told her not to threaten them because humans really did not respond well to threats. It was the casual way he said it that made Lyran feel cold inside, because Danny spoke about not responding well to threats the way someone might mention not enjoying spicy food. She thought about the Krelzar army and the pink mist and the thunder, and she wondered if the council truly understood what they were dealing with. 2 weeks passed, and Lyran continued her observations, while the human colony grew larger every day, and she sent reports to the council, but she could tell from the responses that they did not take her warning seriously. Then the formal delegation arrived with all the ceremony that elven tradition demanded. There were 12 diplomats and 20 guards, and a full honor guard of griffin riders circling overhead, and at the center rode High Counselor Theron himself, wearing robes woven with living vines and carrying his ancient staff that crackled with barely contained magical power. Lyran watched from her position with the guard contingent, and Veilstrix was coiled nearby in her reduced form, which was only 15 feet long instead of her full battle size. The dragon muttered that this would end badly. Lyraean told her to have faith in the wisdom of the elders, but she did not believe her own words. The humans had prepared their own reception on a flat area covered with hard gray substance, and flags bearing strange symbols fluttered in the breeze, and Commander Kate Morgan stood at the center with officers around her. Next to Morgan stood a woman with gray hair and sharp features, wearing different clothing than the soldiers, and Danny had explained earlier that she was Ambassador Helen Shaw, who specialized in first contact situations. Shaw called out a welcome in surprisingly good Elvish and said they were honored by the presence of the delegation. Theron dismounted with the fluid grace of his kind, and his guards formed up behind him, and he introduced himself as High Counselor of the Emerald Kingdoms and said they had come to discuss the human presence in their land. Shaw gestured to a table with chairs and suggested they speak in comfort. The two groups approached, but Lyraean noticed immediately that the humans had only provided 6 chairs on their side, while the elven delegation had 12 diplomats. Theron asked if they were being mocked with insufficient seating. Shaw looked confused, and then understanding came to her face, and she apologized and explained that in human culture, delegations typically sent representatives to the table while others observed. She spoke rapidly into a small device, and within minutes more chairs were being brought out. Once everyone was seated, Theron spoke with formal ancient protocol and said that the humans had encroached upon sovereign territory, and while he appreciated their elimination of the Krelzar, their presence was unauthorized, and he asked them to depart. Peacefully, Shaw explained that their survey indicated this was unclaimed borderland between several territories, and they had specifically chosen this location to avoid intruding on any established nation. Theron explained with barely hidden condescension that the concept of unclaimed land did not exist in this world, and these territories had been balanced through treaties older than human civilization probably was. Shaw offered to negotiate treaties and said they had goods and knowledge to trade. Counselor Maris interrupted and said they did not need human goods or knowledge because they had magic and dragons, and had maintained their civilization for 10 millennia. Without outside help, Commander Morgan spoke for the first time, and her voice carried an edge, and she said they did not want conflict, but they were not leaving, because they had committed significant resources and Earth needed the agricultural potential this planet offered. Theron said that good neighbors respect boundaries, and his staff began to glow softly as a reminder of power. The temperature at the table dropped, and Lyrian saw Morgan tense, and the human soldiers shifted their stances in subtle ways. Shaw raised a hand to calm things, but Theron interrupted and said there was nothing to escalate, and they were simply informing the humans of reality. He told them they had 1 week to depart, or they would be made to leave. Theron stood, and the elven delegation rose with him, and the meeting was over. As they returned to their mounts, Lyraean caught Danny looking at her, and he appeared sad and worried, and he mouthed 2 words. He said he was sorry. The week passed with growing tension in the air, and the humans did not pack up their colony as ordered, but instead they accelerated their construction, and more ships arrived from the sky carrying supplies and people. The council interpreted this as defiance and began preparing for war with absolute confidence in their power. Lyrian was summoned to a war council on the 6th day, and the chamber was filled with battle mages and dragon riders and military commanders who spoke with excitement about the coming battle. Maps covered every surface, showing the human colony from every possible angle. Marshal Kael'thas stood at the center, and he was the supreme military commander of the kingdoms, and he announced they would strike at dawn with overwhelming force. He said they would bring 500 dragon riders and 3,000 battle mages and 10,000 ground troops, and they would crush the humans with a display of power that would leave no doubt about elven superiority. Lyraean spoke up even though it broke protocol, and she said she must protest because she had seen what the humans were capable of in battle. Kael'thas dismissed her concerns and said she had only watched them massacre mindless Krelzar who fought without strategy or discipline, and he said the elves were not like the Krelzar because they had magic and training and aerial superiority. The marshal said that the human thunder could not reach dragons flying at maximum altitude. Lyran looked at High Counselor Theron and silently pleaded for wisdom. But the old elf simply nodded his agreement and said the decision was made, and they would show these humans the price of defying the Emerald Kingdoms. That night Lyrian could not sleep, and she stood on her balcony watching distant lights from the human colony, and she felt Veilstrix's presence in her mind. The dragon said that Lyraean knew this was wrong. Lyraean replied that she knew the humans were more dangerous than the council believed. Veilstrix asked if they should fight tomorrow. Lyraean was quiet for a long time before answering, and she said they were bound by oath to serve the kingdoms, but she would not throw her life away on stupidity. She told Veilstrix they would fly with the host, but they would observe first, and if she was wrong about the humans, they would fight. But if she was right, then they would witness another massacre. Veilstrix said that this time they would be the ones bleeding. Dawn came too quickly, and the sky filled with dragons in formations that were magnificent and terrible to see, and their scales caught the first light and made them look like flying jewels. Battle mages rode the largest dragons, while others flew independently, using enchanted wings that shimmered with power. Below the dragons, the ground forces marched with confidence of warriors who had never truly known defeat. Lyraean and Veilstrix took position in the upper formations, high enough to see everything that would happen as the sun rose. Above the horizon, Marshal Kael'thas raised his sword, and its blade became wreathed in flames, and he roared for the Emerald Kingdoms. 500 dragons began their attack dive toward the human colony, and Lyrian prayed to God she was not sure existed anymore that she was wrong about what would happen next. She was not wrong. The first warning was a sound that set her teeth on edge, and it was a rising whine that grew louder and louder. Strange cylindrical devices throughout the human colony tilted upward, and they tracked the descending dragons with mechanical precision that was terrifying to watch. Lyrian screamed for the dragons to break off their attack, but her voice was lost in the rush of wind and the roar of 500 dragons, committing to their dive. The cylinders erupted with fury. Lyrian had thought the slaughter of the Krelzar was the worst violence she would ever see, but she had been horribly wrong about that. The weapons fired projectiles that moved faster than thought, and each one left trails of smoke and fire in the air. They did not just hit their targets but tore them completely apart. A drake flying near Lyrian simply exploded and its rider was vaporized before he could even scream. Another dragon managed to twist away from the first attack only to be hit by a different weapon that followed it through all its movements before exploding in a massive ball of orange flame. The sky became a nightmare of falling bodies and burning wings, and screaming dragons. Veilstrix spoke into Lyrian's mind with pure panic and told her to dive immediately. The crimson dragon folded her wings and dropped like a stone, falling below the main formations and using the other dragons as cover, while the massacre continued above them. Marshal Caelthus was mounted on his ancient gold dragon named Sunfire, and they managed to get close enough to unleash their most powerful magica lance of pure solar fire, hot enough to melt stone shot toward the human positions. And for a moment, Lyrian felt hope. The lance struck some kind of invisible barrier and simply disappeared as energy washed across a shimmering dome that covered the entire colony. Caelthus' voice carried across the magical communication network, and he shouted that the humans had shields, and he ordered everyone to focus their fire and overload the barrier. A human weapon barked twice with sharp cracks. Sunfire head snapped back and the great dragon tumbled from the sky with the marshal still on his back. The supreme commander of the Emerald Kingdoms fell 3,000 feet and hit the ground with enough force to shake the earth itself. The remaining dragons scattered as their formation broke completely, and primal fear overrode centuries of training. Some tried to climb higher and flee beyond the reach of the human weapons. Others attempted to get closer, believing that getting beneath the guns would save them. Both strategies failed completely. The humans had more weapons and so many different types. Streaks of light reached up from the ground to pluck dragons from the sky like a child picking flowers. Small flying devices swarmed around any dragon that got close, and they exploded against scales and wings with devastating effect. Through it all, Commander Kate Morgan's voice rang out across loudspeakers, and she was terrifyingly calm. As she gave orders to maintain fire and engage ground forces, Lyrian had almost forgotten about the 10,000 troops marching on the colony. She turned Veilstrix around to see their fate and immediately wished she had not looked. The battle mages had raised their strongest shields and were advancing behind walls of pure force that had stopped armies for thousands of years. The humans opened fire with weapons called artillery. The shells did not bounce off the shields but went through them and over them and around them. Some exploded in the air above the army and rained down metal fragments that the shields could not stop. Others struck the ground in front of the shields and created blast waves that traveled through the earth itself and killed from below battle mages who could level fortresses with a gesture, died without casting a single spell. They were torn apart by forces that their magic simply could not defend against. Lyrian gasped and said they had to stop this, and they had to surrender. Veilstrix replied that the marshal was dead, and command had fallen to no one because the communication network erupted with dozens of voices all trying to claim authority. Everyone was shouting different orders, and some demanded continued assault while others called for retreat, and a few simply screamed in terror. Lyrian made a decision that would either save thousands of lives or end her own, she urged. Veilstrix toward the human colony, but not in an attack dive, and instead they descended slowly in a spiral with wings spread, in the universal gesture of non-aggression. Veilstrix demanded to know what Lyrian was doing. Lyrian replied that she was doing something incredibly stupid or incredibly wise, and possibly both at the same time. They landed 50 yards from the nearest human defensive position, and weapons tracked them for every inch of the way down. Lyraean dismounted and walked forward, slowly with her hands raised high and empty. A voice boomed from a speaker and told her to identify herself and state her intentions. Lyraean shouted that she was Ranger Lyraean of the Emerald Kingdoms, and she wished to negotiate surrender before more of her people died. There was a pause that felt like an eternity. Then the voice told her to approach slowly and warned that any hostile action would result in immediate termination. Lyraean walked forward, while acutely aware that dozens of weapons were pointed at her heart. She had never felt more vulnerable in 3 centuries of life. A door in the colony wall opened, and Commander Morgan stepped out with guards flanking her. The blonde woman expression was hard, but not cruel, and she gestured for Lyraean to follow her into a small structure. Inside and away from the chaos, Morgan spoke first and asked if Lyraean understood that her forces were being slaughtered. Morgan said the smart thing would be to surrender, but she needed to know if Lyraean could make it stick, and she asked what authority Lyraean had. Lyraean admitted she had no authority, and that the marshal was dead and the command structure had collapsed. But she was here trying to save lives. Morgan said she appreciated that, and explained what would happen next. She would give Lyraean a radio and teach her how to use it, and Lyraean would broadcast to whatever was left of the army, and tell them to withdraw immediately. Any dragon or soldier that left the battlefield would not be fired upon, but any that continued attacking would be destroyed. Morgan asked if that was clear. Lyraean asked what would happen after that. Morgan said they would stop killing each other long enough to have an actual conversation about coexistence. She told Lyraean that despite what it looked like, humans came here to build and not to destroy. But they would destroy anyone who tried to destroy them first. 3 months had passed since the day that became known as the Dragon's Fall, and Lyraean now stood before a very different High Council than the one she had faced before. Theron was gone, and his own people had executed him for leading them into disaster, and half the other seats were empty, because their occupants were either dead or had resigned in shame. New faces filled some of the chairs, and they were younger elves who understood that the world had changed forever. The council chamber itself had changed too, because hanging on one wall was a large display screen that was a gift from the humans, and it showed footage from the battle. The counselors had watched the footage dozens of times, trying to understand how their greatest warriors had fallen so completely and so quickly. Lyraean had been promoted to the council specifically because she had witnessed both the Krelzar massacre and survived the Dragon's Fall, and they needed someone who understood the humans, because there were very few such experts alive. Counselor Silvara was one of the few survivors from the old council, and she asked Lyraean to report on the human colony status. Lyraean replied that the humans continued to expand, but they did so slowly and with careful observation of the boundaries that had been established together. She said that Ambassador Shaw had been good to her word, and the humans genuinely seemed to want peaceful coexistence. Counselor Bryn was a young elf who had been elevated to the council specifically for his open mind, and he asked if they could trust the humans. Lyraean countered by asking if the humans could trust them after the elves had attacked without real provocation. She pointed out that the humans had defended themselves, and since then they had offered medical assistance and technological exchange, and even help rebuilding what was destroyed. The debate that followed was heated, but eventually the council agreed to Lyraean's proposal, which was a formal exchange. Program elven diplomats and scholars would live in the human colony, while human experts would be welcomed in the kingdom cities, and learning would flow both ways. Lyraean volunteered to be the first permanent elven representative along with Veilstrix. Dragon had become fascinated by human technology, and particularly their spacecraft, and she spent hours asking questions of anyone who would answer. Lyraean found herself working primarily with a human named Dr. Lisa Martinez, who was a xenoanthropologist, and her entire specialty was studying alien cultures. Lisa was endlessly curious and endlessly patient, and she had a sense of humor that Lyraean was slowly learning to appreciate. One afternoon they shared tea in Lyraean quarters, and Lisa asked her to clarify something. Lisa said that Lyraean had lived for 300 years and fought countless battles and bonded with a dragon, but never felt true fear until watching humans fight. Lyraean confirmed that was correct and explained that she had felt afraid before, certainly, but fear for her life was different from fear of a fundamental force she could not comprehend. She said that when she saw human weapons tear through their strongest defenses as if they were paper, and when she realized that all their magic and power meant nothing against technology they did not recognize, that was when she felt existential. Dread Lisa nodded slowly and said that humans felt something similar when they first encountered a race called the Trell, about 60 years ago. She explained that the Trell did not use technology at all, and they were basically crystalline entities that existed in quantum states. The Trell could pass through solid matter and split themselves infinitely and reshape reality at a local level, and all human weapons were completely useless against them. Lyraean asked what happened with the Trell. Lisa smiled and said they talked, and it turned out the Trell were just as scared of humans as humans were of them. The Trell had never encountered biological life before and thought humans were some kind of infectious disease. Once they figured out how to communicate, they became allies and good ones. At that, Lyraean asked if that was what humans did, and she said it seemed like humans killed anything that threatened them and then tried to make friends with the survivors. Lisa admitted that was honestly more accurate than she would like, but she said in their defense humans always tried the friendship route first. She explained that a lot of beings saw different as threat and decided to attack before talking. Lyraean said quietly, that was like what the elves did. Lisa agreed gently and said yes, but pointed out that the elves were not doing that now, and that was what mattered over. The following months, Lyraean threw herself into understanding human culture completely. She learned about Earth and about the wars that had nearly destroyed humanity, and about how they had unified and reached for the stars. She learned about democracy and individual rights, which were concepts that seemed strange to someone raised in a traditional hierarchy. She also learned about human entertainment, which led to an embarrassing evening where Danny Walsh convinced her to watch what he called an action movie. The casual brutality displayed for entertainment horrified Lyraean until Danny pointed out that it was all fiction and all staged with actors. Lyraean asked in bewilderment if humans watched battles that never happened. Danny confirmed that they did and said it was for fun, and it helped them process real violence by putting it in a controlled context. He added that explosions were cool. Veilstrix, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity among the humans because she was the first dragon they had ever encountered. Scientists lined up to study her with her enthusiastic permission, and in exchange they had designed a special harness that let Veilstrix interface with their computer systems. This allowed the dragon to browse the entirety of human knowledge. One evening, Veilstrix asked Lyraean if she knew that humans had visited 17 different star systems. The dragon said 17, and that humans had encountered 8 other intelligent species. Veilstrix said that the elves had thought they were the pinnacle of civilization on this world, but they were not even a footnote in human history. Lyraean asked if that bothered her. Veilstrix admitted it was humbling but also exciting because there was so much more to learn than she had ever imagined. The real test of the new relationship came 6 months after the dragon's fall. A massive Krelzar army emerged from the deep wastes, and it was over 100,000 strong. They had heard about the dragon's fall and saw it as an opportunity because if the elves were weakened and the humans were unknown, perhaps now was the time to finally conquer the Emerald Kingdoms. The warning came from human surveillance satellites, and Commander Morgan contacted Lyraean. Immediately, Morgan told her that a large army was heading their way and asked if the elves wanted help. Lyraean took the question to an emergency council session, and the debate was fierce. Some argued that accepting human military aid would make them seem weak. Others pointed out that pride was what got them into this mess in the first place. Finally, Councillor Bryn stood and proposed something different. He suggested not having human soldiers on elven land, but instead a joint operation, where human weapons and elven magic would work together. He said this would prove they had learned from their mistakes. The proposal passed by a narrow margin. 3 days later, Lyraean found herself standing on a ridge overlooking a valley where the Krelzar were gathering their forces. Next to her was Commander Morgan, and a dozen human soldiers and 50 elven battle mages. Morgan explained the plan while pointing at a holographic map that floated in the air. She said the elven mages would create obstacles like terrain changes and walls and barriers to funnel the Krelzar into kill zones. Her people would provide fire support from range, and if any broke through, the dragon riders could handle them. Up close, Morgan said it would be coordinated and complementary and not competing. It was a simple plan, but implementing it required trust on both sides. The humans had to trust that the mages would not suddenly turn on them. The elves had to trust that the humans would not simply destroy everything, including allies. The battle itself was almost anticlimactic compared to the dragon's fall. The Krelzar advanced with their typical brutality, expecting elven forces that would eventually tire and be overwhelmed. Instead, they found earth that rose, up in walls to block them, and water that appeared from nowhere to create bogs that trapped them. Then came fire raining from human artillery that the mages carefully directed toward maximum effect. The combination was devastating, and the Krelzar had no answer for it. Their chieftains died in the first volley and their army shattered within an hour. Not a single elf or human died in the battle. In the aftermath, both forces helped tend to their own wounded and clean the battlefield. Lyran watched. Humans and elves working side by side, and they were sharing water and sharing stories and sharing the universal relief of soldiers who survived. Commander Morgan approached and asked what Lyran was thinking. Lyran replied that she was thinking, understanding true fear was important, but maybe understanding true cooperation was even more important. Morgan said that was deeper than she expected, and usually soldiers were just processing trauma after battles. Lyran allowed that perhaps she was doing that too, but said it was still true. She explained that the elves were so afraid of humans that they attacked, and then so afraid that they almost withdrew from the world entirely. Now they were learning to work with humans, and she thought that was the first truly brave thing they had done. Morgan said that for what it was worth, humans were terrified of the elves too. She explained that they were not afraid of elven magic because 10 years had passed since the day humans first arrived and tore the sky open, and the world had changed in ways that no one could have predicted back then. Lyran stood on the observation deck of a human spacecraft high above the planet, and she looked down at the world she had known for 3 centuries, and it looked different from up here. The Emerald Kingdoms were still green and beautiful, but now they were connected to the human city by roads and railways, and the lights from both civilizations blended together in the darkness like stars fallen to earth. Next to her stood Captain Danny Walsh, though everyone called him Colonel now after his promotion, and he was looking at the same view with a smile on his face. Danny said it was hard to believe this was the same place where they almost killed each other. Lyran agreed and said that fear made people do terrible things, but understanding could make them do beautiful things. Below them, a shuttle was preparing to launch, and it carried the first joint expedition to the outer planets of this solar system, and the crew included both humans and elves working together. Veilstrix was down there too because the dragon had insisted on being part of the exploration team, and the humans had built a special environmental suit for her that looked ridiculous but worked perfectly. Lisa Martinez had retired from active field work and now ran the Institute of Interspecies Studies that had been built on the border between human and elven territory, and students from both civilizations studied there, learning about each other. The Institute had become famous across human space as a model for successful first contact, and other human colonies requested elven advisors to help them establish good relationships with whatever species they encountered. Some elves had even traveled to Earth and returned with stories of oceans that covered entire continents and cities, with billions of inhabitants and technology that seemed like magic even. To those who knew, it was just science. The younger generation of elves had grown up with humans as neighbors and friends, and they did not carry the same fear and prejudice that the older generation once had. Human children learned basic magic in schools while elven children learned basic science, and the line between the two became increasingly blurred. Some of the brightest minds from both species worked together on projects that combined magic and technology in ways that neither could achieve alone. They had created healing devices that used both medical science and life magic, and they were 10 times more effective than either approach alone. They had built communication systems that used magical crystals enhanced with human transmitters, and they could send messages across the entire planet instantly. They had even developed new weapons, though Lyran was less enthusiastic about that particular achievement. The council had changed completely over the decade, and now half its members were young progressives who saw the human arrival as the best thing that ever happened to their civilization. Councillor Bryn had become High Councillor, and he governed with a focus on cooperation and mutual growth, rather than isolation and tradition. There were still traditionalists who resented the human presence and who saw the changes as a corruption of elven purity. But they were a shrinking minority. Most elves recognized that the humans had brought opportunity and knowledge and a wider perspective on the universe. The humans had their own debates about the colony, and some on Earth argued that they were changing too much to accommodate the elves and losing their own identity. But most humans recognized that adaptation was necessary for survival, and that learning from the elves made them stronger, not weaker. Ambassador Helen Shaw had been promoted to colonial governor, and she managed the growing human population with wisdom and patience. She had learned to speak Elvish fluently and understood elven customs better than most elves understood them, and she was respected by both species. Commander Kate Morgan had retired from active military service and now trained the Joint Defense Force that included both human soldiers and elven warriors. Defense Force had never seen combat because word had spread across the land about what happened to those who attacked the Alliance, and even the most aggressive neighboring kingdoms chose diplomacy over war. The Krelzar had retreated deep into the wastes and stayed there, because their entire civilization had been traumatized by the ease with which humans and elves working together had destroyed their armies. Some Krelzar had even approached the Alliance asking for trade and education, and slowly they were beginning to change from savage raiders into something resembling civilization. Lyraean had mixed feelings about that because she remembered centuries of Krelzar atrocities, but she also remembered her own people attacking the humans out of fear and ignorance. If elves could change, then perhaps even the Krelzar could change. She spent most of her time now writing and teaching because she had begun documenting everything that happened from first contact to the present day. Her book was called Understanding Fear and Understanding Hope, and it had become required reading for anyone involved in interspecies relations, anywhere in human space. Students from a dozen different human colonies came to study with her and learn from her experiences. She told them that fear was natural when encountering something unknown, but that acting on fear without trying to understand first led to disaster. She taught them that strength was important, but wisdom was more important, and that the greatest power came from cooperation, not domination. Some of her students were young humans who would go on to make first contact with new alien species, and she hoped her lessons would help them avoid the mistakes that nearly destroyed both humans and elves. One afternoon, Lyraean was teaching a class when an alarm sounded across the campus, and it was not a drill because the tone was different. She dismissed her students and hurried to the command center where screens showed something. Emerging from the deep space beyond the solar system, it was another vessel but not human, and not from any species that humans had encountered before. The ship was massive and organic-looking with curves and flowing lines that suggested it had been grown rather than built, and it was broadcasting a signal that the computers could not translate. Governor Shaw called an emergency meeting, and Lyraean attended along with Colonel Danny Walsh and High Counselor Bryn and Commander Morgan. They gathered in the Situation Room watching the mysterious vessel slowly approach the planet. Shaw asked what they should do, and whether they should prepare for combat or attempt communication. Morgan pointed out that the vessel had not made any hostile moves, and was broadcasting what seemed like a greeting, even if they could not understand it yet. Bryn suggested they try every form of communication they had, both technological and magical. Lyraean remembered standing on a cliff top 10 years ago watching a human vessel descend and feeling fear of the unknown. She remembered how that fear had led to war and death and how close they had come to destroying each other. She spoke up and said they should send a small ship to meet the newcomers with representatives from both humans and elves. She said they should approach with openness and curiosity rather than suspicion and fear. Shaw looked at her and asked if she would be willing to go. Lyraean said yes, without hesitation, because she had learned that understanding required courage and someone had to take the first step. Danny volunteered to go with her, and so did 3 other humans and 2 young elves who had grown up in the mixed society. They took a small shuttle and approached the alien vessel slowly, while broadcasting greetings in every language they knew. As they got closer, Lyraean felt her heart racing, but it was not the same fear she had felt 10 years ago. This was excitement mixed with nervousness and hope mixed with caution. The alien vessel opened. A port and lights beckoned them inside. They landed in a bay that was filled with soft, bioluminescent light, and creatures emerged that looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. They were tall and slender, with multiple limbs and skin that changed, colors like flowing water, and they moved with grace that seemed impossible. One of them approached and touched a device on its chest, and suddenly it spoke in halting but understandable English. The alien said they were called the Vane, and they had been watching this planet for some time. They had seen the war between elves and humans, and they had been afraid to make contact, because they feared they would be attacked like the elves had attacked the humans. But then they watched the two species learn to cooperate and build something beautiful together. The Vane said they wanted to learn from that and perhaps become part of it. Lyraean felt tears in her eyes because she realized that her choice 10 years ago to surrender and seek peace had rippled outward in ways she never imagined. She had not just saved elven lives that day, but she had created an example that gave hope to other species watching from the darkness. She stepped forward and introduced herself as Lyraean of the Emerald Kingdoms and representative of the Human-Elven Alliance. She said they would be honored to teach the Vane everything they had learned about cooperation and understanding. The Vane leader, whose name translated roughly as Shimmer, expressed gratitude and said they had brought gifts of knowledge and technology to share. Over the following weeks, the Vane integrated into the Alliance community, and they brought with them biological sciences that neither humans nor elves had imagined. They could grow buildings from living materials and create medicines that cured diseases thought incurable, and shape ecosystems with precision that seemed miraculous in exchange.